About halfway between West Egg and New York, the motor road hastily joins the railroad and runs alongside it for a quarter of a mile, so as to shrink away from a certain desolate area of land. This is a valley of ashes, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens, where ashes take the form of houses and chimneys and rising smoke. And finally, with transcendent effort, of ash-gray men who move dimly and already crumbling through the powdery air. But above the grey land and the spasm, occasionally a line of grey cars crawls along an invisible track and comes to rest and gives out a ghastly creak. And immediately, ash-grey men with leaden spades, ash-grey men swarm up with leaden spades and stir up an impenetrable cloud which screens their obscure operation from your sight. But above the grey land and the spasms of bleak dust which drift endlessly over it, you perceive after a moment the eyes of Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg are blue and gigantic. The retinas are 1 yard high and they look out of no face, but instead out of a pair of enormous yellow spectacles which pass over a non-existent nose. Evidently some wild wag of an oculist set them there to fatten his practice in the borough of Queens and then sank down himself into eternal blindness or forgot about them and moved away. But his eyes, dimmed a little by many paintless days under sun and rain, brood on over the solemn dumping ground. The Valley of Ashes is bounded on one side by a small foul river, and when the drawbridge is up to let the barges through, passengers on the waiting train can stare at the dismal scene for as long as half an hour. There is always a halt here of at least a minute, or at least a moment. At least a minute. And it is because of this that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. The fact that he had one was insisted upon wherever he was known. His acquaintances resented the fact that he strolled into popular cafes with her, that he turned up in popular cafes with her, and sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew, and leaving her at a table. Sauntered about chatting with whomsoever he knew. Shit. Though I was curious to see her, I had no desire to meet her, but I did. When I went up to New York with Tom on the train one afternoon, as we stopped by the ash heaps, he leapt to his feet and, taking hold of my arm, literally forced me from the car. "We're getting off," he insisted. "I want you to meet my girl." I think he tanked up a good bit at luncheon, and his determination to have my company bordered on violence. The supercilious assumption was, on a Sunday afternoon, I had nothing better to do. I followed him over a low, whitewashed railroad fence and along the road 100 yards or so under Dr. Ecclesburg's persistent stare. The only buildings in sight was a small block of yellow brick, or a small square of yellow brick. Sitting on the edge of the wasteland, a sort of compact main street ministering to it and contiguous to absolutely nothing. One of the buildings was for rent, and another was an all-night restaurant approached by a trail of ashes, and the third was a garage, repairs, George B. Wilson, cars bought and sold, and I followed Tom inside. The interior was unprosperous and bare. The only car in sight was the dust-covered wreck of a Ford, which crouched in a dim corner. It occurred to me that this shadow of a garage must be a blind, and there were sumptuous and romantic apartments concealed overhead, when the proprietor himself appeared in the doorway of an office, wiping his hands on a piece of waste. He was a blond man. He was a blond, spiritless man, anemic and faintly handsome. When he saw us, a damp gleam of hope sprang to his light blue eyes. "Hello, Wilson, old man," said Tom, jovially slapping him on the shoulder. "How's business?" "I can't complain," said Wilson unconvincingly. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Soon." "Next week," said Tom. Next week. I've got my man working on it now." "Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he doesn't," said Tom coldly. "And if you feel that way about it, maybe I'd better sell it somewhere else after all." "I don't mean that," said Wilson hurriedly. His voice faded off. I just meant that. His voice faded off. Then I heard footsteps on a stairs, and the thickish figure of a woman blocked out the light from the office doors. She was in her middle 30s and faintly stout, but she carried her flesh sensuously, as some women can. Her face, above a dress of dark blue spotted crepe de Chine, contained no facet or gleam of beauty, but there was an immediately perceptible vitality about her, as if all the nerves of her body were continually smoldering. She smiled slowly and, walking through her husband as if he were a ghost, shook hands with Tom, looking him flush in the eye. She wet her lips and, without turning around, spoke to her husband in a soft, coarse voice. "Get some chairs, without you, so somebody can sit down." "Oh, sure," said Wilson, hurrying off in the direction of the office. His office mingling immediately with the cement color of the wall. A white ashen dust veiled everything. A white ashen dust veiled his hair and his dark suit, as it veiled everything in the vicinity, except his wife, who moved closer to Tom. "I want to see you," he said. "Get on the next train." "All right," she said. We'll meet you by the newsstand on the lower level." She nodded and moved away from Tom just as George Wilson emerged from the office with 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road and out of sight. It was a few days before the 4th of July, and we watched a gray, scrawny Italian child setting torpedoes along the railroad track. "Awful place, isn't it?" said Tom. "Terrible place, isn't it?" said Tom, exchanging a frown with Dr. Eckelberg. "Awful. It does her good to get away. Doesn't her husband object? Wilson, he thinks she goes to visit her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." And so Tom Buchanan, his girl, and I went together up to New York. Or not quite together, for Mrs. Wilson sat discreetly in the next car. Tom deferred that much to the sensibility of those East Eggers that might have been on the train. She had changed her dress into a brown figured muslin which stretched over her rather wide hips as Tom helped her down to the platform at New York. At the newsstand, she bought a copy of the Town Tattle and the Broadway Scandal sheets and a moving pictures magazine. And at the drugstore, she bought a small flask of perfume and some cold cream. In the solemn, echoing drive, she let 4 taxicabs go by before selecting a new one, lavender in color with gray upholstery. And in this we slid from the mass of the station into the glowing sunshine. But immediately, she turned sharply from the glass and tapped on the front window. Immediately she turned from the glass and sharply tapped on the front window. Let me see it. "I want to get one of those dogs," she said earnestly. "They're a nice thing to have for the apartment," she said earnestly. Eagerly? Fuck! Every time. "They're a nice thing to have," she said eagerly. For the apartment. We backed up to an old gray man who bore an absurd resemblance to John D. Rockefeller. In a basket swung from his neck cowered a dozen or so very recent puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" asked Mrs. Wilson eagerly. "All kinds. What kind do you want, lady?" "I'd like to get one of those police dogs," she said earnestly. Fuck. No, it's 3 things. "I'd like to get one of the police dogs. I don't suppose you got that kind." The man peered doubtfully into his basket, plunged in a hand, and drew one up, wriggling by the back of the neck. "That's no police dog," said Tom. It's not a police dog It's not exactly a police dog," said the man. "More of an Airedale. Look at that coat. Some coat. That's a dog that'll never bother you with catching a cold. I think it's cute," said Mrs. Wilson. "How much is it?" That dog will cost you $10. The Airedale, surely there was some Airedale mixed in there somewhere, but though its paws were shockingly white, changed hands and settled down in Mrs. Wilson's lap, where she fondled the weatherproof coat with rapture. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked delicately. "That dog? That's a boy," said the man. "It's a bitch," said Tom. "Here's your money. Go and buy 10 more dogs with it." We went on over the park. We drove over to Fifth Avenue, warm and soft, almost pastoral on a summer Sunday afternoon. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a great flock of white sheep turn the corner. "Hold on," I said. "I've got to leave you here." "No, you don't," interposed Tom quickly. I think I have this wrong. "Besides, Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come to the apartment." "Come on," said Mrs. Wilson. And I do have that part on. "Come on," said Mrs. Wilson. I'll telephone my sister Catherine. She's said to be quite beautiful by people who ought to know." We cut back across the park towards the West Hundreds. At 158th Street, we pulled up to one slice in a long white cake of apartment houses. Mrs. Wilson, throwing a regal homecoming glance around the neighborhood, Mrs. Wilson gathered up her dog and her other purchases and went haughtily in. "I'm going to have the McKees come up," she announced as we rose in the elevator. And of course I've got to telephone my sister Catherine. Or telephone my sister too. The apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with tapestried furniture much too large for it, so to move about was to stumble continually over scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. The only picture on the wall appeared to be the image of a hen sitting on a rock, but viewed from further away, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet and the rock into a stout old lady. On the coffee table was a copy of Simon Called Peter and the Broadway Scandal Sheets. A reluctant elevator boy was dispatched for a box of... I'm gonna sneeze. Was dispatched for a box of straw and some milk, to which he added of his own initiative a tin of hard dog biscuits, one of which sat decaying apathetically in the milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from behind a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened had a dim, hazy cast over it, even though until 8 o'clock, or 6 o'clock, the apartment was filled with warm sunlight. Mrs. Wilson, sitting in Tom's lap, made several telephone calls. Then there were no cigarettes, so I went to the drugstore on the corner to get some. When I came back, they had disappeared. So I sat discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff, or the whiskey had distorted things, because I couldn't make sense of it, because it didn't make any sense to me. When they reappeared, when Tom and Myrtle, after our first drink, we called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced arriving at the apartment doors. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30 with a solid, sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. The eyebrows had been plucked and drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature towards the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. There was an incessant clicking as innumerable pottery bracelets jangled up and down her arms. There was an incessant clicking as she moved, as innumerable pottery bracelets jangled up and down her arms. She came in with such proprietary haste and looked at the furniture so possessively I wondered if she lived there. When I asked this, however, she laughed immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and said that she lived in an hotel with a girlfriend. Mr. McKee was a slender, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a spot of white lather on his cheeks, and he was most respectful in his greetings to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer, and it was he who had taken the enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hung on the wall like an ectoplasm. Which stared down into the room like an ectoplasm. His wife was shrill, handsome, languid, and horrible. Shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. Shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She told us with pride that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they'd been married. Mrs. Wilson had changed her dress again into a cream-colored chiffon that rustled as she moved. And with the change of costume came a change of attitude. Gone was the impressive vitality from the garage, and in its place, gone was the something vitality. The garage, and in its place was an impressive hauteur. And as she grew bigger, the room got smaller, until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. These fellas are only interested in one thing, she yelled to her sister. These fellas will cheat you every time, she yelled to her sister. They're only interested in one thing. I had a lady up here to look at my feet, and when I got the bill, you'd think I had had my appendicitis out. What was her name? Asked Mrs. Wilson, Miss McKee. Mrs. Eberhardt. She goes around looking at people's feet in their homes. I love you in that dress. I like your dress, said Mrs. McKee. Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment with a raised eyebrow. This thing, it's just something this crazy old thing, or this crazy thing, it's just something I throw on when I don't care what I look like. But you look wonderful in it, insisted Miss McKee. If we could get you in that pose, I think Chester could really do something with it. We all looked in silence as Mrs. Wilson removed a strand of hair from over one eye. I think that's all I got. I never do this. She phoned, got the lady who was a photographer. He had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. His wife was shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. 27 times. Changed her costume sometime before, now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave it a continual rustle as she swept about the room. With the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment. As she expanded, the room grew smaller around her, until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy creaking pivot through the smoky air. "My dear," she told her sister in a high, mincing shout. So that was one of the things I forgot, was high, mincing shout. "Most of these fellas will cheat you every time. All they think of is money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet, and when she gave me the bill, you'd have thought she had my appendicitis out." What was her name? People's feet. "I like your dress," remarked Mrs. McKee. "I think it's adorable." Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment by raising her eyebrow in disdain. That's different from what I said. "It's just a crazy old thing," she said. "I just slip it on sometimes when I don't care what I look like." "But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean," pursued Miss McKee. "If Chester could only get you in that pose, I think he could make something of it." We all looked in silence at Miss Wilson, who removed a strand of hair from over her eye and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. So that's where I should be. I gotta tighten this up. Doing it like barely getting in one run through of each chapter a week just isn't cutting it. Okay, bye.